Once again, please take your seats. Hopefully folks had enough time to grab lunch, get settled, come on back in. One technical note that I'd like to mention. Again, to underscore that we try to leave no detail undone. Folks wearing green lanyards will be volunteers, will be staff, will be folks who could help you out if you have questions. If you're looking for volunteers with question cards, look for the guys with the green lanyards walking up and down the aisles. We've got Chris Hines over here. We've got somebody with questions on to my left, and keep the questions coming. We're also taking questions from our audience online, and those questions will be coming up via our online attendants, bringing them here to the moderator, and don't forget to also make comments and let folks know what's going on. #Chow2015. I mentioned earlier this morning that we have pin sites from around the country, and some of our early news on Chow came not from Washington, D.C., but from Alpena, Michigan. And so I'd like to thank our audience in Alpena, Michigan, watching in the Maritime Heritage Center for the sanctuary. And please keep your questions coming in over the course of the next panel. So we've got a really wonderful panel in store for you today to look at Cuba-U.S. relations as those relations thaw, to talk about marine conservation at the forefront of new diplomacy between Cuba and the U.S. is a very exciting opportunity, and one that we'll explore over the next hour. To moderate this discussion is Cornelia Dean, science writer for the New York Times and writer-in-residence at Brown University. Corey has been with us before. She moderated our leadership panel a couple of years ago, and we're really excited to have her back a second time. Corey is distinguished lecturer and writer-in-residence at Brown, which I just mentioned, founding member of the advisory board at the Metcalf Institute for Environment and Marine Reporting, which we've had as a partner for Chow in the past. She's written a lot of articles about Cuba, which you can get online and which I encourage you to read. And Corey has also written about our Lifetime Achievement honoree, Dr. Jeremy Jackson. So Corey is very familiar with the issues here, and we're excited that she's going to moderate this discussion. Corey?
Thank you. So the United States and Cuba have a long history of research collaboration. Cuba, I believe, established the first Academy of Sciences anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. In the 19th century, people from the Smithsonian collaborated with Cuban colleagues on various research projects, and in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, similar efforts with Harvard and other institutions here. However, since the Cuban Revolution, and especially since the imposition of the embargo in 1962, most people's focus on Cuba as it relates to the United States has been kind of in the geopolitical sense and not in the scientific sense. However, all the while, there have been collaborative research efforts going on between researchers in this country, marine and environmental researchers in this country, and their colleagues in Cuba. So that's, but as Ambassador Bolton said in one of our preliminary discussions, we seem to be at a place now, what he called an inflection point. Looks like there's going to be a change in the basic relationship between the United States and Cuba, which opens up a bunch of interesting possibilities, which is good because Cuba is the largest landmass in the Caribbean. It sits at the confluence of the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean Sea. As such, it is an incredible biodiversity hotspot. And because of the economic pressures of the embargo, it has not developed the way other countries in this region have developed, which is to say, it is a real gem of environmental beauty. And you have only, I would say, some people might argue with me, but you have only to look at the Florida Keys to see what kind of alternatives there are for this kind of thing. But in any event, so our discussion today is going to focus on what lies ahead as relations change between the United States and Cuba. I'm going to introduce the panel But first, we have a short 90-second video that just will give you a vivid taste of the kinds of ecological treasures that are still surviving in Cuba.
This is really the most incredibly well-protected and flourishing reef I've ever seen. The corals are healthy, the fish are healthy and abundant. There are predators here, large sharks. It's the way these ecosystems really should look.
We brought special scuba masks with us so we could talk underwater. Every time we went diving, we could see sharks circling our boat before we even went in. David said they wouldn't bother us, and we certainly hoped he was right. The first thing you notice in this underwater Eden is the coral, its color, its texture. Coral isn't a rock or a plant, it's colonies of tiny animals that share a common skeleton. This is a large and relatively rare specimen of pillar coral. Those hair-like things are the tentacles of thousands of individual animals that are plucking microscopic plankton from the water. What makes coral reefs so important is that they host an extraordinary variety of fish. Some come here for shelter from predators, others come here to eat.
I've been diving in many places all over the world, and I've never seen so many large fish like this grouper here. There's about 6 or 7 Caribbean reef sharks exist, circling around right now. Scientists will tell you the presence of so many sharks and different species of shark is a sign it's a very healthy reef.
So, and that's only a small taste of what exists now in Cuba. So I just want to tell you who everybody is, and then we'll just dive into the questions. To my immediate left is the Honorable Sheldon Whitehouse, DRI, Senator Whitehouse. He is a member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and also an organizer of the Senate Oceans Caucus. He has long advocated for an endowment, a national endowment for the oceans, a dedicated source of funding for research and work on ocean issues. To his left is Ambassador Jose Ramon Cabañas Rodriguez, who has the chief of mission of the Cuban interest section of the Swiss Embassy in the United States. So basically the Cuban ambassador to the United, I guess we can't say that yet, but we live in hope. Ambassador Cabañas has been in the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs for years. He's had posts in Europe, Austria, also accredited to Croatia and Slovenia, and he is a senior professor at the Raul Roa Garcia Higher Institute of International Relations in Havana. To his left is David A. Balton, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries in the United States Department of State. And he worked for 6 years as Director of the Office of Marine Conservation and works in international law on areas like the law of the sea, human rights, and international claims. He also juggles oranges. So thought I should include that. To his left is Robert Muse, who is an attorney here, and he has represented many environmental NGOs, including the Environmental Defense Fund, the World Wildlife Fund, the New York Botanical Garden, and other groups as they negotiate the legal labyrinth of obtaining permission to work in Cuba. And to his left is David Guggenheim, the man you saw in the video just now, who is the president of Ocean Doctor, which is a nonprofit marine conservation organization based here. And Ocean Doctor, David says, focuses about 90% of its efforts on marine conservation in Cuba. So, I have some prepared questions, but you have cards to write them down in, and so anything you want to ask, feel free. So, Ambassador Balton, I thought I would ask you to start by just describing the kinds of diplomatic difficulties that have existed in relations between the U.S. and Cuba in the context of doing this kind of research, and then to tell us how you think that situation might change going forward.
Thanks very much, Cornelia. Good afternoon, everyone. The diplomatic situation between the United States and Cuba has made it difficult to cooperate on areas related to marine conservation, marine science. Here in the United States, we are striving to become better stewards of the ocean space under our jurisdiction, but no country can solve the problems of the ocean by itself. We need to work collaboratively with other countries, including your close neighbors. But the situation between the U.S. and Cuba has made that challenging. There have been restrictions on travel and communication. The two governments have not until recently been able to talk very easily to one another. Private people in the U.S. have been under restrictions in the types of activities they can undertake in Cuba and with Cubans. And so it has, yes, had some, there's been a palpable lack of bilateral work. It was true that multilaterally the two governments could work together in regimes that involved other countries, both in the region but also globally through the UN. But there was a difficulty working directly. Several months ago, President Obama announced that the two countries are moving to restore diplomatic relations, and this, I think, is opening up some new space for work in a lot of fields, including the field of marine conservation, marine science. Yes, I think we are at an inflection point. And we do think it should be possible for the two governments to cooperate more effectively bilaterally on this range of issues in ways that are mutually beneficial. We in the United States could benefit greatly from this type of enhanced cooperation. And we think it should be possible as well to facilitate the work of private, scientific, non-governmental academic institutions in both countries to work in collaboration as well.
Dr. Guggenheim, can you just tell us briefly, can you give us some examples of the kinds of difficulties that you have encountered as a researcher?
In Cuba, there are many shortages. So I'll start there, but I'll say there's no shortage in Cuba of talented, bright, dedicated, passionate scientists. And it's difficult because their reality is working with very, very limited resources. So some of the best things we can do with our Cuban colleagues is get them aboard vessels to do marine research. And that's what we've done for the last 15 years, working in close collaboration. But it's very difficult. We have a slow-moving bureaucratic process here.
You mean to gain approval for this kind of work?
In terms of getting licensing because of the economic embargo. So anytime you're spending money, it has to be for something directly related to that research. And until recently, when Cuba was on the list of terrorist nations, that meant that there was an extra level of scrutiny, and it was very difficult to bring in anything, practically anything that had a chip in it, from laptops to navigation equipment and other scientific gear. And this is, even once we tried to send a 17-foot Boston whaler with a 40 horsepower outboard down to support our work, and we're denied because of one or the other of the restrictions we may never know.
So practical things really got in the way? Like
practical things, very much so. In addition to not really enjoying carrying $15,000 stuffed into my pants because of the lack of banking relationships. The only way to transfer money back and forth sometimes is cash.
Senator Whitehouse, you have spoken about the mutual benefits that can arise for the United States and for Cuba out of collaborative activities in this area. Can you talk a bit about what are the things you would hope would move forward if we manage to get a better relationship with Cuba?
Yeah. Before I do that, let me just put in a quick plug for Cornelia, who teaches at Rhode Island's own Brown University, and she teaches a class called The Misuse of Scientific Information in American Life. And when the history of this era is written and people look back, the systematic misuse of scientific information, the systematic creation of front groups in order to proselytize the misuse, and the systematic perversion of the American political process in order to prevent us taking necessary steps, both to protect the climate, to protect the oceans, is probably going to be the big story. So thank you for what you are doing, and thank you for doing it at Brown. This is such a big opportunity for us. There are immediate things that can and should happen. For instance, making sure that there are search and rescue capabilities back and forth, and whoever's nearest to the vessel that's in trouble has the ability to go and render aid.
And that does not exist now?
Does not exist now. It's being developed now. We share the same ecosystem down there between Cuba and South Florida. So what happens in one affects another. Working jointly on marine protected areas to make sure that some of these areas are preserved. They're just great, great opportunities in addition to the scientific opportunities that Dr. Guggenheim talked about. And it really matters that we do this because everywhere you look, the oceans are sending off terrific signs of distress. I mean, Arctic to tropic, bottom of the food chain to top, near to far. Wherever you look, there are alarm bells ringing. And the Caribbean is a real alarm bell in terms of particularly what's happening to the coral reefs. And then you go to Cuba and you see what David's film shows. I had the pleasure of going down there on my own time and my own nickel and actually diving there. And it is astonishing, particularly when you look at these stories about how, the coral reefs in the Caribbean are effectively dead in a few decades. Something is happening in Cuba that is a lesson for the rest of us in how to do it. And we really need to make sure that as our economic relationship with Ambassador Cabañas's country develops, we're not bringing in all those malevolent forces that will degrade those resources before Cuba has a chance to build in the countermeasures necessary to protect it. So there's a lot at stake, and it's a wonderful opportunity.
The World Wildlife Fund describes Cuba's corals as pristine, and it says this is their phrase is a stark contrast to the situation everywhere else in the region. So, Ambassador Cabañas, so because of the embargo, I guess largely because of the embargo, research has been difficult in Cuba. Resources have not necessarily always been available. And David is among the many people who have spoken eloquently about the way researchers do a great deal with not enormous resources and achieve really important work in this field. But my question for you is, do you see that situation changing as diplomatic relations become more normal between the two countries?
Well, thank you, Cornelia. Thank you for the invitation, and Senator, ambassadors, and member of the panel. Well, in regards to that question, as Ambassador Balton mentioned, what we have had is a decision from the executive power here in the United States, from the administration, to change the path in bilateral ties. But the embargo is still in place, it's still in force, no matter that we have new regulations that they make more easy to do some things bilaterally, but most of the structure of what you call embargo and what we call blockade in Cuba is there, and there is a debate in Congress precisely right now, and it will be in the future, hopefully, to make changes on that set of rules. And as you said, it has been a limit. It's very tangible regarding resources, banking services, as it was mentioned here. But no matter what, our own scientists and scientists from the United States, they have been able to travel and to be in contact with our people. Before the announcement in December the 17th, we have to say that we were already discussing bilaterally many ways and means to create a new atmosphere between ourselves. We have been welcoming several official delegations on that regard from the United States. This month there is one particular related to sciences in general. But at the same time, let me tell you that the embargo had another meaning, which is thanks to the embargo and thanks to the blockade, we were able to develop our own resources. We were able to learn by ourselves many things, and we invested heavily in sciences in Cuba. Right now we have leading scientists in many sectors, but still the material part of the effect is there, and we have shortages for many equipments and techniques we hardly need in Cuba.
So, Senator Whitehouse, when will the embargo be lifted?
I couldn't guess, but we are certainly absolutely going in that direction. It is only a matter of time, and it will be the right thing when it's done.
Okay. And Mr. Muse, so you have done a lot of work with a lot of different NGOs in Cuba, helping them be able to do their work in Cuba, environmental NGOs. And what do you see going forward? If relations improve, what kind of things would you see happening going forward if it were not so, I think it's probably hideously complex to do this kind of thing now, if that complexity goes away?
It's not actually all that complex. The embargo is a set of regulations that the president has a great deal of authority over. So when we talk about these restrictions, they don't descend from the heavens. They're policy decisions. They can be rescinded as easily as they were imposed. So if the president wanted to, he could essentially deregulate scientific research, travel to Cuba, exports to Cuba for scientific purposes. The president did a lot of that on January 15th, went some way toward doing that. There's now a presumption in favor of granting export licenses to...
That did not exist before?
It did not exist before. So the president's going some way down that road. What most concerns me is it's an ad hoc set of presidential determinations. What we've argued for, a coalition of NGOs, is an agreement between the U.S. and Cuba to memorialize their agreement that they will facilitate the work of NGOs in Cuba.
What does that mean, memorialize?
Memorialize it in language matters here, and neither side right now, I think, wants to use the word agreement, but they could style it a joint communique, a declaration, something of that sort. That would shelter this cooperation, memorialize it. We're going to have a new president in January 2017, in a year and a half. What this president's done can be undone by the next president. And some of the candidates for the Republican nomination have said they intend to roll back what the president's doing on Cuba. So again, we think it's of important symbolic effect that this agreement declaration be entered into by the U.S. and Cuba. And I'm not sure why it hasn't been done yet. I'll stop there.
Dr. Guggenheim, I know this is an issue that's on your mind, and we have a question from the audience that relates to it, which is, how is Cuba preparing for the potential large investments for tourism infrastructure? That was another thing that when the World Wildlife Federation was talking about the environment in Cuba, they said that they felt the major threat to it was the potential influx of, I always think of it as a wave of American asphalt, but infrastructure investment. So how do you think Cuba will react to that kind of situation?
But it's interesting because I just returned from Cuba Saturday night from leading a trip called How Cuba Went Green and What the Future Holds. So we were talking about exactly these issues. And fortunately, almost anywhere else in the world I would worry more. Cuba has very strong environmental laws, they have very strong foreign investment laws, and they have been open to the rest of the world for the last 50 years with very good results. But we're Americans. We have a little too much money, we're pushy as hell, And over time, after a few decades, you can see the results of American influence in the Caribbean. And a report came out last year that showed 50% of coral cover in the Caribbean has been lost since 1970. Cuba listens to its scientists in terms of its policy, and that's one of its best assets. And we've been working collaboratively to do the science. I think science is the foundation of strong environmental policy. And the science has moved into economics, environmental economics. Cuba actually requires the use of environmental economics in its Law 81 of the environment. And we are working with Cuban environmental economists and U.S. environmental economists to try to address that. But there's also a need to engage communities in Cuba and the private sector. We're actually going to launch the very first environmental film festival in Cuba next year to engage Cuban communities and really get them more involved and make them proud of the amazing accomplishments that they have and should be proud of in Cuba. But I'm very happy to announce also that we have just launched a new initiative in collaboration with the Center for International Policy and Robert Muse and Associates called the Cuba-U.S. Sustainability Partnership, or CUSP, which is designed to engage the would-be investors, the corporations, the developers, to develop and adhere to a set of guiding principles and best practices for development in Cuba. And there's a need on the Cuban side for this as well. There's a whole new generation of Cuban entrepreneurs and a need to engage on best sustainable business practices. I think this is a unique moment in history where the embargo is still in place. There's a lot of concern and a lot of opportunity to work together and a chance to really help Cuba leapfrog over all the madness that we've seen happen in the Caribbean and other places over the last few decades.
So I don't know whether this is for Senator Whitehouse or Ambassador Bolton, but the question relates to the potential for oil spillage in Cuba, especially if there's oil drilling there now. Is that something that the United States should be working with Cuba to, have systems in place in the event of disaster or that kind of thing? Or
the short answer is yes. During the Deepwater Horizon incident in the United States, I think we all came to realize some of the dangers with large-scale oil spills. Indeed, there was some concern that the oil from that event might enter Cuban waters. It didn't, at least not in any significant amount. Cuba has also been exploring for oil off its north shore, and that caught a lot of attention here in the United States. We have been able to work through a multilateral process to develop some oil pollution contingency plans with Cuba, but there is more to do. And I think in this new space that is opening up, this should be one of the topics the two governments explore together.
so one of our members of the audience noticed in the short clip that there was a lionfish swimming along. And that's, I gather, an invasive species, an unwanted shipment from the United States that managed to evade the embargo and get to Cuba. But the person's related question is, many migratory species make their way through the Straits of Florida. What potential vehicles legally could there be to help manage these species? And I'm thinking even of manatees or other animals that we care about here, but that are also important in Cuba. And I don't know who that's for. Does anybody have a...
If there are no other takers, so invasive species are a big problem in the marine environment, also I'd say in the terrestrial environment. That should be on the list of things that U.S. and Cuba talk about together. There are also shared positive resources in the ocean that we might want to work together to better conserve and manage. Bluefin tuna spawn, Western Atlantic bluefin tuna spawn in the Caribbean and in waters that we share. We want to be able to work together with Cuba and the other countries in whose waters those animals spawn to better understand the spawning stock. There are any number of things that reasonable governments and countries living side by side work on together.
And I would
If I
just
may,
add
if I-
that
Oh, wait, Ambassador
Go ahead.
Cabañas?
Just to add on that, I mean, this is more than a bilateral concern. We have concerns here, we have concerns in Cuba, but you have 14 island states in the Caribbean. And when we talk, for example, about drilling, we have a multilateral understanding. Bahamas is too close to both of us. They also have plans for drilling offshore. I would say that scientists at both ends, they have discovered many things. Now diplomats and probably politicians, we have to follow that knowledge. But you have concerns everywhere. And now we realize that it's better that we get together, we address those concerns, and we agreed on how to handle them.
One little factoid on the lionfish is that the Cubans, being adaptive and creative, are training the predators along these reefs to eat the lionfish.
Oh, really?
And they've gone from more or less feeding the lionfish to sharks and groupers to now, on occasion, they've actually spotted them hitting them on their own in the native environment without the lionfish having been injured and made look more like prey beforehand. So if that can be proven to work, then suddenly a little bit of balance is restored to let the natural environment fight back against that particular invasive predator. And they're not bad to eat if you happen to.
And the key there is
one.
you need a healthy environment with an intact predator population in order to make that work. And that's what the opportunity in Cuban ecosystems is, to be diving with that many top predators who are hungry and now getting a little more adventurous in their cuisine, fortunately.
Which is not the case elsewhere in the world. The top predators have been
Wiped out.
fished out, yes.
Exactly.
So, Ambassador Cabañas, is there an environmental movement in Cuba? And are there organizations that are prepared to step up and protest if something happens that they think is not good for the environment?
Well, first, let me tell you that we are not afraid of you coming to Cuba, because through many questions here, it seems some comments that people will think, well, they are afraid and now about the possibility of having more visitors from the United States. As Dr. Guggenheim was saying, we have very tough regulations on environment in Cuba. We have a ministry dedicated to that and sciences, I mean environmental issues and sciences. And we have many NGOs related to the subject. We have faculties and professor organizations in Cuba addressing to that. The conservation of environment is on our constitution. I mean, it's a principle that we follow. And of course, we take into consideration the important opinions that not only our population, but the local governments and people concerned, and even visitors. We host in Cuba several international events devoted to environment, and we share our views with our neighbors, with others, and we learn from them as well.
Was there opposition inside Cuba to the idea of oil exploration?
Well, there were concerns as well. We are developing not only oil drilling, which is doing everybody in the region, but we are also exploring alternative sources of energy like anyone else. We have concerns, but again, you have seen, for example, how we have developed tourism and tourism facilities, and like in Jardines de las Reinas, which is Queen's Gardens and to the south of Cuba, you see that you don't have facilities there. You have actually to go, and you cannot be hosted nearby, simply to protect that. And the Cuban agency responsible for the protection of environment has been responsible for stopping projects, sometimes national projects, but foreign projects to invest in Cuba just for consideration of the environment.
I'd be interested to, if Mr. Muse or Dr. Guggenheim, how difficult is it going to be to resist the economic benefits of tourism?
Well,
Go ahead.
I think.
I guess I would say
I
we've done
think
a
if
kind of
you-
a poor job of it in this country.
Let me,
So,
let me give you my what I've been saying all week, which is, if you want to get drunk on the beach and have somebody serve you umbrella drinks, don't go to Cuba. Cuba is an authentic experience, and a beautiful environment, a rich culture, and that is something people are willing to pay a premium for. And I think that, interestingly, the marketing slogan today is Cuba Auténtica, authentic Cuba. And to me, that means the environment as well. I think you can have your culture without selling it out to tourism. I think you can have ecotourism that's true ecotourism that really benefits local communities. And you can have an educational travel experience. So I'm very optimistic that Cuba has the best possible raw materials to create not only benefit to their economy, but stay true to who they are.
There is mass tourism into Cuba, but I think the Cubans have done a good job of centralizing it in places like Veradero, the central north coast of Cuba. So, therefore, the impact is more limited than, Cuba has strong coastal protection laws as well. So, and I think there's a national consensus. Cuba has had the opportunity to learn from a lot of disastrous development in the Caribbean. I think that lesson's been taken on board, so I don't expect to see it replicated there, what's happened elsewhere.
Ambassador Cabañas, would you agree with that?
Of course I do. Most of the time I agree with Dr. Muse. No, I was thinking on a particular example when we had a year ago a visit from a group of experts on environment and marine protection, and among them the former president of the BP Commission, to the Macondo disaster, and they realized after a contact with our experts and officials related to environment, we implemented in Cuba all the recommendations of that report. All of them are implemented. It's not the same situation you have in other countries, not only the United States, but in the Caribbean basin. There. We have people looking for that objective. We have people protecting the areas. And if I may add a comment on the protection, what Dr. Guggenheim was saying, and thank you for your kind words about our specialists, but also the way we protect from negative impact of tourism and other foreign presence, we have our people taking part of that. I mean, it's not only the national institutions or experts or scientists, but in all Havana, for example, and we are not talking now of the ocean, but it's a place that is well kept and well protected precisely because the local population is still there. I mean, it's not something developed for tourism, and the local population take care of the facilities, the services, and what is available at the place. Thank you.
So here's a question kind of related to the tourism issue, I guess. Cuba has some of the most talented scientists working in its public institutions. However, we currently are watching economic opportunities emerge for its people with the possibility of entrepreneurial options and increased salaries. Has the Cuban government thought about how it is going to retain scientists in the public sector with increased competition from the growing private enterprise or quasi-private enterprise?
The same kind of sports you have all over, you know. you have always competition from the private sector to the government. That's a risk, but we will face it, of course.
Okay. Are there other countries that collaborate with Cuba on environmental issues? Another question from the audience.
Yes, several. We have several bilateral agreements signed with the European countries and Latin American countries mainly, yes.
Okay. So, David.
Which David?
Oh, sorry, Dr. Guggenheim. So, if everything went brilliantly in a year from now, what would be happening in Cuba with your group or with marine research in Cuba?
Well, I think the way I see the world is with the science being the foundation, and I would love to see science getting more support. It's from both sides to do the kind of work, and I think collaborating, and now with opportunities to do true government-to-government collaboration. Don't forget the NGOs. We still want to participate. But I think that there are new opportunities. There's so much that's unknown about Cuban waters and the connections to our own waters. I mean, Cuban fish do grow up to be American fish. We know that. And we have a very selfish interest in knowing about what's going on in those waters. I think also providing the Cubans and helping them help themselves with good, strong decision tools and continuing along this path. I mentioned environmental economics without defining it, but it's really putting an economic value on the natural environment, something that we really failed to do until recent years and destroyed places like Everglades, only now to have to pay billions of dollars to restore them. And I think it's great that the Cubans are out front on that, and I think the more that we can collaborate in areas like that, I think that would be great. My dream, it might not happen in a year, but what I think could be a very exciting vision for Cuba is that sustainability becomes an export of Cuba the way medicine and biotechnology have become very strong professional exports. Cuba can become this fantastic green jewel of the Caribbean, and if you want to learn how to be sustainable, you go to Cuba. You go and you see 70% of the countryside in organic farming, and you see how to make do with less and still have high quality of life in many cases. I think that could be a very strong economic and environmental benefit for Cuba.
So here's a question. I don't really know if we know exactly what the answer, well, you all will know maybe, but what can U.S. citizens do, I guess as private people, to support researchers and scientists in Cuba? Ambassador Bolton, you got any thoughts?
So we live in a participatory democracy. Individual citizens in the United States have the ability to make their voices heard. Some of that could be directed at Senator Whitehouse and his colleagues. Some of it can be directed at the administration.
Please.
Yeah, seriously. And we listen and respond. So if the directions that David Guggenheim and Robert Muse are things that you care about, you let us know in any way, in any number of ways you have to let us know. That's the nature of the country we live in.
If someone wanted to contribute money to a research operation in Cuba, is that doable here?
That's perfectly legal.
It is? It's legal? Okay. So here's another tourism-related question. I guess everybody here, like me, wants to go to Cuba. So, as part of the tourism mix envisioned, is there a role for cruise ships? Do cruise ships visit Cuba now? Yes, they do.
We have, several coming from Europe and Central America as well. And yes, it's a possibility that we could have them in the near future from United States. Recently, as part of the regulations that were published and mentioned by Ambassador Bolton, we have one on commercial vessels that most of the media has interpreted as just ferries, but it's actually something else. And there is a lot of interest from several companies in United States and Europe to be part of that. It's a possibility.
Is it worrisome? Is it something that would worry you, David, Dr. Guggenheim?
I'm just thinking about an anecdote. A good Cuban friend of mine, scientist, told me last week about how they were doing research in Isle of Youth, and all of a sudden a Spanish cruise ship pulled up and sent its launches in with about somewhere between 500 and 1,000 visitors. Basically took over the beach. They had to pull anchor and leave the study area. And I think I think we've all seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of the cruise ship industry. At its worst, it dumps thousands of people into a community and forever changes that community into a tourist-serving community. I think and hope Cuba is smarter than that, and it can be very well managed. But I think it's inevitable. There are already cruise ships there. It doesn't have to be the horror that we all envision. I think it can be managed, but it also means managing the size of these ships, and again, making sure that the community that absorbs these tourists can absorb them not just from an engineering standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint as well.
So, does anyone have thoughts? How would you say the regulation of land use in Cuba compares to similar regulations elsewhere in the Caribbean? For example, Mr. Muse, are the NGOs that you deal with, are they doing similar work elsewhere in the Caribbean, and how does it compare with working with Cuba?
Cuba land use regulations are very similar to what you find throughout pretty much the Western Hemisphere. Cuba spent a lot of time in developing a regulatory and legal structure, particularly in regard to its coastal zones. So it's not, and it's also has strong cadres of environmental scientists that are authorized to enforce those regulations. So I don't think Cuba, it would be a total misconception to think Cuba is underprepared for an American invasion, that it's not going to be quite like that. That they do have well, I'm repeating myself, but they do have a strong regulatory and legal framework that governs development in Cuba.
So what I wanted to sort of end by asking everybody, suppose we are able to arrive at a better relationship between the United States and Cuba, and we are able to enhance research communication between the two countries. How will we know that those efforts have borne fruit in a way that we care about? What, I guess, which is another way of saying, what do we hope for? What are your, so Senator Whitehouse, what are your
For
hopes?
me, it would be a follow-up to what Dr. Guggenheim said. I went on a climate tour down the Atlantic coast, and I ended up in the Keys. And the mayor of Monroe County, we met with her. She's very keen on addressing climate change and on all the issues that she's facing with the rising sea levels for the Florida Keys. And I asked her, how's the snorkeling and how's the scuba diving off the Keys? And she said, it's wonderful, unless you were here 10 years ago. In Cuba, it's not wonderful unless you were there 10 years ago. It's the way it's supposed to be. And if you look all around the Caribbean, you see places where it's wonderful unless you were there 10 years ago, unless you were there even 5 years ago. And trying to learn the lessons that have enabled Cuba not to be wonderful unless you were there 10 years ago, but to be really intact, and try to re-export that to the rest of the Caribbean and to our South Florida coast, and to revive the natural environment of the reefs and the waters would be the gift that we should seek.
From Cuba.
From Cuba.
Ambassador?
Well, looking into the future, I think we have, for the first time in many years, probably is the first time ever, the opportunity to have a discussion on the foundations of our bilateral relations, and to agree on many things and to disagree on many others. But since December 17th, you have an open door, and that future is actually on your hands. You know, a few of people in a particular place or in a particular city is a debate that should be nationwide. Many people are engaged in that debate, and hopefully at the official level, we will be able to manage that and to have many agreements, among them basically on sciences and environment. That's our hope.
So in my line of work, I'm looking for understandings between governments, either bilateral or multilateral, that are both effective and durable, things that can last. Earlier, Mr. Muse was talking about some type of umbrella understanding that would allow for greater cooperation, not only between people in both governments that want to work together more, but also between private NGO, scientific, academic organizations that want to do this sort of work. My hope a year from now is that we will have something like this in place that can be both effective and durable.
not a regulatory regime, but a regime of interaction.
Something that would facilitate cooperation on environmental issues writ large. It wouldn't necessarily be limited to the marine environment. There are terrestrial environment issues as well. There's things like search and rescue and mapping, and in fact, there's a boundary between the U.S. and Cuba, not all of which has been delimited. There would be another issue there. So there are a range of things that could be done under this umbrella, I think.
Well, I second that. That's exactly what I would like to see, as an agreement, an enduring agreement between the U.S. and Cuba, memorializing both countries' commitment to environmental protection.
I wanted to reassure Senator Whitehouse that one of our projects is actually focused on the lessons from Cuba's coral reef and looking at resilience, understanding why Cuba's coral reefs are so healthy, and what an opportunity to create a blueprint for restoration of coral reefs elsewhere in the Caribbean. So I think I look forward to the lessons that we can learn from Cuba, like Senator Whitehouse, but also I look forward to working with Cuba being fairly routine. That next year when we have this panel, we've got some Cuban scientists up here that we got with a few weeks advance notice, that I'm about to dash out for my flight direct from DCA to HAV. And you know, we are working together and reaching a new level of collaboration as friends and colleagues.
Thank you all very much.
So each of these discussions could go on easily for an hour longer than we have time for. A big thank you to everybody on the panel, to Corey for moderating. I want to give a special thank you to Senator Whitehouse. For all of us who've worked on the Hill or lobby on the Hill, everybody knows how difficult it is to secure any time at all with a member of Congress, a member of the Senate in particular. And then to take that appointment off campus, the distance between here and just down Pennsylvania Avenue within view can sometimes seem insurmountable. So to have the senator dedicate a full hour to us for these discussions, to engage in an intellectual, insightful, meaningful way really is wonderful. It's a wonderful reflection of you, Senator, wonderful reflection on Capitol Hill Ocean Week. And just another word about what you do down Pennsylvania Avenue. There's no more eloquent, more forceful speaker on behalf of the ocean, on behalf of the environment, on behalf of sound science-based policy than we have in both houses, 535 members. There's nobody better than Senator Whitehouse. And the thing is that it is so deeply felt personally, it is so deeply expressed, not only passionately, cerebrally, and Senator's commitment to Capitol Hill Ocean Week year in and year out really is a reflection of that passion and that commitment. Senator, thank you very much. So once again, another 15-minute break, and then we'll be back here at 1:30. Thank you.